Our reading this morning is from Carrying Hope by Václav Havel. I am not an optimist because I am not sure everything ends well. Nor am I a pessimist because I am not sure everything ends badly. I just carry hope in my heart. Hope is the feeling that life and work have meaning. And you can have it regardless of the state of the world that surrounds you. Life without hope is empty, boring, and useless. I could not imagine that I could strive for something if I did not carry hope in me. It is as big a gift as life itself. Hope is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Hope is a state of mind, not of the world. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously heading for success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good.
When I was 14, my parents received a phone call from a local character. Ragtime Jack Radcliffe was known for his outlandish songs that he chose and his ability to play the piano, and he'd perform these at the coffee house my mother ran at the local Unitarian Universalist Church in New Bedford. And Jack even had my father as a science teacher many, many years before. And the reason why Jack was calling my family was because he had been chosen to sail a 40-foot catch from New Bedford down to New York City and back. And he was looking for one more hand, and he was wondering if my parents would volunteer me at 14 to go down and do some sailing. My parents said yes. I think I said yes too, but my parents said yes. And so during the last weeks of June 1980, after school, I would head down to the shipyard and learn about sailing from Jack. And for 2 weeks, I put linseed oil on wood, I coiled rope, I put sails up and took them down and tied knots, lots and lots of knots. And eventually we were ready to sail. And Jack told me to go and buy some rain gear. And he said, and get one of those rain hats like the guy on the frozen fish has. The next day he inspected my purchases, that hat, a pair of bright yellow rain pants, a bright yellow raincoat, which he then took from me, pulled out his knife, and cut the hood off. I said, why did you cut the hood off of my brand new raincoat? And he said, I will tell you after our first storm. And so the next day, off we went, sailing out of New Bedford Harbor, like generations of men in my family had. They left to hunt whales. We left for pleasure. And off we sailed to Newport. It was a cold, gray day, and soon the fog set in. And quickly, Jack sent me up to the very front of the boat, up to the bow, to look and listen for buoys. I'm not sure if you know this, but each buoy has its own number and often has its own sound. so that you can sort of figure out where you are, even when you can't see where you are. And after a few hours of creeping along and me pointing towards a buoy and away from a buoy, we safely made it into Newport for the night. The next morning, we were up early and ready to set sail for Block Island. Block Island is about 27 miles in a straight line from Newport, but of course, in a sailboat, you don't sail in a straight line. You've got to tack back and forth, keeping the wind in your sails, which is fine. We weren't in a rush. And that day at first was beautiful. The sun was shining, and I actually remember seeing the U.S. Coast Guard's tall ship, the U.S. Eagle, sailing past us in the other direction, its sails showing golden in the sun. And then, there's always an and then in stories like this. And then the sky started to darken. And soon it was difficult to tell the difference between where the sea ended and the sky began. And Jack told us all to get our rain gear on and our life vests. We sailed right into a squall, and our little ship was tossed, and so was my lunch. And Jack swore at us, and he yelled and swore some more, and eventually I understood that he wanted me and the other crewmate to head forward, to take down the sail and tie it up with ropes, and then to hang on. It was quite rough for a while, but eventually we made it into Block Island. Though we didn't actually make it into the harbor, we made it into another small little harbor. It was close enough. I have to tell you, after going through that storm, being able to put down the anchor there in sight of land was beautiful. It was, in fact, the image of hope. I mean, I didn't have language for it at that point. I was just 14. But I understood how wonderful it was to arrive safe and sound in this peaceful harbor. What did Emily Dickinson write about hope? Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without the words that never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, and yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Now, I tell you this 43-year-old story because it illustrates, at least in part, where we find ourselves 1,031 days since we went into lockdown on March 13th of 2020. None of us had any idea the impact that pandemic would have on the world, on our nation, on our politics, on our children, on our elders, on our churches, on our relationships, and on ourselves. 3 years, or almost 3 years out, we have searched for a path through a fog, and we've had a number of storms. But instead of finding a peaceful harbor, we've just found ourselves in a different fog bank, more often than not, trying to figure out how to get through to the next one. And then another little storm blows up. Remember when it seemed like the biggest problem we had was trying to figure out how to get toilet paper? It seems quaint, doesn't it? And then there was the shortage of cars and other products. And then a mental health crisis. And the lack of teachers. And now we really see the impact of climate change because, well, For a long time, we weren't distracted by our daily commutes and other pursuits of work. I have to be honest that there were times during that, what a friend calls that unfortunate season, there were times when I thought that perhaps it was going to usher in something really transformative for all of us. Like during the protests after the murder of George Floyd. I thought, wow, this pandemic is going to initiate a cultural revolution. Out will go all of the systems of oppression, and in will come new systems of accountability. It's going to be amazing. And then 2 years ago, in the days after January 6th, I wondered how long until the streets were filled with reactionaries, and I wondered if Canada would take us in. When I think back to those early days of the pandemic, I was worried for those right around me, my wife and my daughters, my parents, my sister, my nieces and nephew, their families. And as things developed, I started to try and find ways to get through it. We all did. We all knew we were lost in a fog, listening to the sound of buoys, watching for signs that would hopefully get us to a peaceful harbor. We know so much more than we did that time, and yet we haven't really reached that place that quite seems normal. And to be honest, I wonder how many of us even know what normal looks like anymore. We are living at a time of great mystery. We know that we can't go back to what was. That boat has sailed. And we're also not really sure what it is that we want. Not only are we sure of we're not really sure of what's going to happen in this world that we are now living in, but we find ourselves living in this great mystery. We've been reminded in the starkest terms that we are finite beings. Seeing friends and loved ones dying and sick, we are reminded that we are not in control, that we really aren't sovereign, that we are limited and mortal. We are just not in control of the world as the way we thought we were before. Yet we still want to be in control. We act like we still can be in control, but to be honest, too much has happened. We are seeing the broken system of our nation, the healthcare system, the political system, the economic systems. We saw bad decisions made. We saw opportunities missed. We saw people plunged into chaos. People were panicking because their idols were failing them. We were panicking because our idols were failing us. We are living in a time of great mystery because we really don't know what is coming next. The theologian Phyllis Tickle, and I have to be honest that I only really remember her name because her last name was Tickle. Phyllis Tickle popularized an idea that about a dozen years ago in a book called The Great Emergence. It was this idea that every 500 years in Western culture, there's a great upheaval that happens, going all the way back to the Babylonian exile, and then the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, the sacking of Rome, the Protestant Reformation, and then today, here we are. And that every time one of these great upheavals happens, people basically look at the institutions that were created for them. It's like she says, it's like a giant yard sale that goes up. And all of the institutions that we have gotten used to, all of the institutions that were created for people of a previous time, we come around, we look at, we poke, and we kind of go, this doesn't fit us anymore. let's take some of this and take some of that, but we don't need that whole thing. And here we are at another one of those moments, one of those cultural moments. I mean, we heard Jack talk about how not just this church, but all religious institutions, to be honest, all religious institutions are kind of going, people aren't coming back. What's happened? What's going on? And part of it is that people are wondering if these institutions really fit their lives anymore. I mean, people certainly still have the big questions in life, probably even more so than before the pandemic. The big questions about what is our purpose here in this world as individuals, as communities. What is our connection with nature? What happens after we die? And people just aren't sure whether or not the religious communities around them are there to ask and answer these questions. People have those questions, and they want to be able to find a place where they can ask those questions in a way and hopefully not be judged for the questions that they ask. We are so lucky as Unitarian Universalists. We're all about the questions. We're not always all that great about giving people the answers that they think they might want. But for us, asking that question allows us to reshape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The thing about humans in moments like this, in times of great mystery, is that we are very good at creating ways of expressing ourselves, finding ways to show that we are alive at this moment. Think of all the things that people did during the pandemic, during the real lockdowns. We all learned new technological skills. Even my parents, who I never thought would learn how to use Zoom, they even learned it a little bit. Some of you, maybe you learned a language. Maybe you got one of those Peloton bikes and you lost. You got into shape. Maybe you learned how to play a ukulele. Maybe you just used that time to slow down. You were reminded of what was really important in your life. It gave you the time to think about the things that make life worth living. And why did you and why did all of us do those things? Because we all have hope that there is something worthwhile to come out on the other side of all this. What did Václav Havel write? Hope is the feeling that life and work have meaning, and you can have it regardless of the state of the world that surrounds you. Hope is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Hope is a state of mind, not of the world. After that first storm on that boat, after setting anchor off of Block Island and straightening out the sails that were so hastily taken down and putting up the lights, I asked Jack if he would finally tell me why he had cut the hood off my new raincoat. And he said to me, well, I did it in case you fell overboard. With a hood like that, it would just fill up with water and it would pull you right down. And I didn't want you drowning on my watch. So here we are today. Maybe we are ready to cut away those things that once we thought necessary, but in fact wasn't needed at all. We are ready to remake ourselves into something new. We are ready for our next adventure. And that, my friends, that feels like hope.